the incredible journey of an ordinary man who became the father of all nations, facing challenges, trials, and miracles along the way. In a distant time, when the world was vast and mysterious, there lived a man named Abraham. His story is a testament to faith, courage, and obedience that echoes through the centuries, inspiring millions of people around the world. Abraham was born as Abram, the son of Terah, in the city of Ur of the Chaldeans, a thriving metropolis in ancient Mesopotamia. Life in Ur was comfortable and predictable, marked by the rhythm of the seasons and the rituals of a society that worshipped many gods. Abram grew up learning the customs of his people, but something within him longed for more. He felt there was a greater purpose for his life, something beyond the walls of Ur and the traditions of his ancestors. One day, when Abram was already an adult, married to his beloved Sarai, something extraordinary happened. A voice, unlike any other he had ever heard, spoke directly to his heart. It was the voice of the one God, the creator of all things. "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you," said the voice. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing to others." Abram was astonished. Leave everything behind, go to an unknown land. How could he, an ordinary man, become the father of a great nation? Thousands of questions arose in his mind, but one certainty overshadowed them all. This was the voice of the true God, and he must obey. With his heart full of anticipation and a bit of fear, Abram shared the news with Sarai. His wife, a woman of great faith and courage, supported the decision to follow the divine call. Together, they began preparations for the journey that would change not only their lives, but the course of human history. The news of Abram's departure quickly spread throughout the city of Ur. Friends and family were perplexed by his decision. Some called him crazy for abandoning the safety and comfort of his homeland. Others, impressed by his conviction, wished him luck on his journey, and Abram and Sarai didn't leave alone. Lot, Abram's nephew, decided to accompany them, along with a group of servants and shepherds. They gathered their flocks, packed provisions, and prepared for the long journey ahead. On the morning of their departure, the streets of Ur were filled with people who came to say goodbye. Tears were shed, hugs exchanged, and blessings bestowed. Abram took one last look at the city that had been his home for so many years, etching every detail into his memory. The caravan set out at sunrise, leaving behind the familiar silhouette of Ur. As they moved forward, the landscape gradually changed. The fertile plains of Mesopotamia gave way to more rugged and challenging terrain. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The journey was arduous, testing everyone's physical and emotional endurance. Scorching heat during the day and biting cold at night were constant companions. Rivers had to be crossed, mountains climbed, and deserts traversed. Throughout the journey, Abram maintained his unwavering faith. On starry nights, he gazed at the sky and remembered the divine promise. "Look up at the sky and count the stars. If indeed you can count them," the voice in his heart said, "so shall your offspring be." Sarai, always by Abram's side, was a constant source of strength and encouragement. Her faith complemented her husband's, and together they faced each new challenge with determination and hope. After months of travel, Abram's caravan finally reached the borders of Canaan, the land promised by God. The contrast with Mesopotamia was evident. Canaan was a land of lush hills, fertile valleys, and surprising geographical diversity. Abram led his group through the region, marveling at the beauty of the land that God had chosen for them. They camped near Shechem, a place considered sacred by the local inhabitants. It was there, under the oak of Moreh, that God appeared again to Abram. "To your offspring I will give this land," the Lord promised. Moved and grateful, Abram built an altar at that place, the first of many he would erect in his journey through Canaan. Life in Canaan was not easy. The land was already inhabited by various peoples, each with their own cities and customs. Abram and his group were foreigners, viewed with suspicion by some of the local inhabitants. Despite the challenges, Abram continued his journey through the Promised Land. He settled for a time in the hills between Bethel and Ai, where he built another altar to the Lord. There, he and Sarai began to put down roots, learning the rhythms and secrets of the new land. Abram's flocks prospered, and his wealth increased. His reputation as a just and God-fearing man began to spread among the Canaanites. Many came to seek his counsel and blessings. However, the promise of a great offspring seemed distant. Abram and Sarai had no children, and the years passed. The faith of both was constantly tested, but they clung to the divine promise, trusting that, in due time, God would fulfill his word. A few years after settling in Canaan, a severe famine struck the region. The rains failed, the crops withered, and the pastures dried up. Abram found himself facing a dilemma: remain in the promised land and risk losing everything, or seek refuge elsewhere. After much reflection and prayer, Abram decided to take his family and flocks to Egypt, a land known for its abundance even in times of scarcity. The decision was not easy, as it meant temporarily leaving the land that God had promised them. The journey to Egypt was challenging. Abram's group had to cross the arid Sinai desert, facing sandstorms, water shortages, and the danger of wild animals. Throughout the journey, Abram led his people with courage and wisdom, always trusting in divine protection. As they approached the Egyptian border, a new fear arose in Abram's heart. Sarai, his wife, was a woman of great beauty, and he feared that the Egyptians might kill him to take her. In a moment of weakness and fear, Abram asked Sarai to pretend to be his sister. Sarai's beauty did not go unnoticed. She was taken to Pharaoh's palace, while Abram was treated with great honor, receiving gifts and favors. However, Abram's heart was heavy with guilt over his lie and concern for his beloved wife's fate. God, in his mercy, did not abandon Abram and Sarai. Terrible plagues fell upon Pharaoh's household, and soon the truth came to light. Pharaoh, fearing the wrath of Abram's God, returned Sarai and ordered them to leave Egypt immediately. Abram left Egypt a changed man. The experience taught him about the consequences of acting out of fear instead of faith. He returned to Canaan with material wealth, but more importantly, with a deeper understanding of God's faithfulness and the importance of integrity. Back in Canaan, Abram returned to the altar he had built between Bethel and Ai. There, he offered sacrifices of thanks to the Lord for his protection and forgiveness. The experience in Egypt strengthened his faith and made him value the promised land even more. However, new challenges soon arose. Both Abram and his nephew Lot had prospered greatly. Their flocks had multiplied, and the land seemed insufficient to support both groups. Conflicts began to arise between Abram's shepherds and Lot's. Abram, always seeking peace, recognized that it was time for an amicable separation. With wisdom and generosity, he offered Lot the choice of lands. "If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left," Abram said. Lot looked around and saw the fertile plain of the Jordan, well-watered and like the garden of the Lord. Without hesitation, he chose that region for himself, moving with his family and flocks to the cities of the plain, including Sodom. Abram, true to his word, settled in the land of Canaan. After Lot's departure, the Lord spoke again to Abram. "Lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south, east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you, and your offspring forever." God renewed his promise, assuring Abram that despite Lot's separation, the divine plan for his life remained intact. The Lord promised Abram offspring as numerous as the dust of the earth, reaffirming his commitment to the patriarch. Encouraged by these words, Abram moved his camp and lived near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron. There, he built yet another altar to the Lord, establishing a place of worship and communion with God. Some years passed, and peace in the region was broken by a war between kings. Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, along with an alliance of other kings, attacked and subdued the cities of the plain, including Sodom, where Lot lived. When Abram learned that his nephew Lot had been captured, he did not hesitate to act. Gathering 318 trained men born in his household, Abram led a daring rescue mission. Pursuing the invading kings as far as Dan, in the northernmost part of Canaan, Abram and his men launched a night attack. Abram's strategy was successful. He managed to defeat the kings and rescue Lot, along with all the goods and people that had been captured. This military victory demonstrated not only Abram's courage and skill, but also his loyalty to his family and his trust in divine protection. Upon returning from this victorious expedition, Abram was met by two notable kings. The first was Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. Melchizedek blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." In response, Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything, recognizing the spiritual authority of the priest-king and expressing gratitude to God for the victory. The second king to meet Abram was the king of Sodom, who offered Abram all the goods recovered, asking only for the return of the people. Abram, however, nobly refused the offer, declaring that he had sworn to the Lord not to accept anything belonging to the king of Sodom. He wanted it to be clear that his wealth came from God, not from men. This episode marked Abram as a respected and feared leader in the region. His reputation as a just and powerful man spread, but Abram remained humble, always giving glory to God for his victories and blessings. After these events, the Lord appeared to Abram in a vision. "Do not be afraid, Abram," God said. "I am your shield, your very great reward." Abram, though grateful, expressed his concern. "O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?" The promise of a great offspring seemed distant as Abram and Sarai remained childless. God, in his infinite goodness, took Abram outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then God proclaimed, "So shall your offspring be." Abram, gazing at the starry sky, felt his heart fill with hope. The vastness of the night sky, filled with countless points of light, was a visual testimony to the greatness of the divine promise. At that moment, Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. To seal this promise, God established a formal covenant with Abram. Following divine instructions, Abram prepared a covenant ritual, cutting various animals in half and placing the halves opposite each other. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, Abram saw in a vision a smoking firepot with a blazing torch pass between the pieces, symbolizing the presence of God, sealing the covenant. In this vision, God revealed to Abram the future of his descendants. They would be strangers in a land not their own, would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But God promised to judge the nation that enslaved them, and afterward, Abram's descendants would come out with great possessions. As for Abram, God promised that he would have a long life and die in peace at a good old age. In the fourth generation, his descendants would return to the promised land. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants, I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." Years passed, and Sarai remained childless. God's promise seemed distant, and the wait became increasingly difficult. Sarai, feeling the weight of the years and fearing she might never bear a child for Abram, made a decision based on the customs of the time. She said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my servant Hagar. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to Sarai's proposal. Hagar, an Egyptian servant, conceived a child by Abram. However, this situation brought new conflicts to the family. Hagar, seeing herself pregnant, began to despise her mistress Sarai. The tension between the two women grew, leading Sarai to treat Hagar harshly. Unable to endure Sarai's treatment, Hagar fled into the desert. There, by a spring of water, an angel of the Lord found her. The angel instructed Hagar to return and submit to Sarai, but also made a promise. "I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count." The angel also told Hagar that she would bear a son and that she should name him Ishmael, which means God hears, for the Lord had heard of her misery. Hagar returned and gave birth to Ishmael when Abram was 86 years old. This experience taught Abram and Sarai an important lesson about patience and trust in God's timing. Although Ishmael was loved by Abram, he was not the child of the promise that God had planned. 13 years after Ishmael's birth, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him again. God reaffirmed his covenant, saying, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless." In this encounter, God changed Abram's name to Abraham, which means father of many nations. This name change symbolized the transformation God was working in Abraham's life and the grand destiny that awaited him. God also changed Sarai's name to Sarah, promising that she would be the mother of nations and that kings would come from her. Abraham, hearing this promise, fell face down, but laughed inwardly, thinking, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? Despite his momentary disbelief, Abraham obeyed when God instituted the covenant of circumcision. All the men in Abraham's household, including himself and Ishmael, were circumcised that very day as a visible sign of the covenant with God. This act of obedience, even in the face of what seemed impossible, demonstrated Abraham's growing faith and his willingness to follow God's ways, no matter the cost. On a hot day, Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent near the great trees of Mamre when he saw 3 men standing nearby. Immediately, Abraham hurried to meet them and invited them to rest and eat. With the characteristic hospitality of that culture, Abraham quickly prepared a meal for the visitors. He asked Sarah to bake some bread while he selected a tender, choice calf to be prepared. While the visitors ate, one of them asked, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" Abraham replied that she was in the tent. Then the visitor made a surprising statement. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Sarah, who was listening at the entrance to the tent, laughed to herself. She thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" The Lord, for it was he who spoke, asked Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah, afraid, denied that she had laughed, but the Lord said, "Yes, you did laugh." This encounter reaffirmed God's promise and prepared Abraham and Sarah for the miracle that was about to happen in their lives. The visit of these 3 men, later revealed to be the Lord himself, accompanied by 2 angels, marked a turning point in the story of Abraham and Sarah. After the meal, the men got up to leave, looking toward Sodom. The Lord, deciding not to hide from Abraham what he was about to do, revealed his plans to judge Sodom and Gomorrah, cities known for their great wickedness. Abraham remembering his nephew Lot, who lived in Sodom, approached the Lord and began to intercede for the city. With humility and boldness, Abraham asked, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it?" The Lord replied that if he found 50 righteous people in Sodom, he would spare the whole city for their sake. Encouraged, Abraham continued his intercession, gradually reducing the number of righteous needed to save the city. With each question, Abraham demonstrated both his compassion for the city's inhabitants and his deep respect for God's justice. Finally, Abraham asked if God would spare the city if only 10 righteous people were found. The Lord answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." This conversation between Abraham and God reveals much about both their characters. It shows God's mercy and patience, as well as his willingness to listen to the pleas of his servant. On the other hand, it reveals Abraham as a man of compassion who cared deeply about the well-being of others, even those living in sin. Abraham's intercession for Sodom is a powerful example of how we can approach God in prayer, interceding for others with humility and persistence. As promised, the Lord visited Sarah, and she conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. Sarah, amazed at the miracle that had happened, said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." The name Isaac, which means he laughs, was a constant reminder of the joy this son brought and of God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promise. Abraham circumcised Isaac on the 8th day, as God had commanded. The arrival of Isaac was a celebration not only for Abraham and Sarah, but for the entire community around them. Many came to see the son of promise, marveling at the power of God that had worked this miracle. However, the joy of Isaac's birth was soon followed by new challenges. Tensions arose between Sarah and Hagar, and consequently between Isaac and Ishmael. Sarah, seeing Ishmael mocking Isaac, asked Abraham to send Hagar and her son away. This decision was painful for Abraham, who loved Ishmael. But God spoke to Abraham, assuring him that he would take care of Hagar and Ishmael, and that he would make Ishmael into a great nation as well. With a heavy heart, but trusting in divine providence, Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael away. Years passed, and Isaac grew into a young man. Abraham's life seemed to have finally reached a point of stability and fulfillment. It was then that God subjected him to the most difficult test of his life. God called Abraham and said, "Abraham." He replied, "Here I am." Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Abraham's heart must have broken at hearing these words. Isaac was the child of promise, the one for whom he and Sarah had waited so many years. How could God ask him to sacrifice his own son? Yet, Abraham's faith remained unshaken. The next morning, he got up early, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his servants and Isaac, and cut enough wood for the burnt offering. Then they set out for the place God had told him about. The journey must have been agonizing for Abraham. For 3 days they traveled, with the weight of the divine command heavy on his heart. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He told his servants to stay with the donkey while he and Isaac went up the mountain to worship. Isaac, carrying the wood, asked his father, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. Isaac continued, "The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's response reveals his deep faith. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the angel said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." This event, known as the sacrifice of Isaac, is considered the ultimate test of Abraham's faith. He demonstrated his willingness to obey God above all, even when it meant sacrificing what was most precious to him. After the sacrifice of Isaac, Abraham lived many more years. He saw Isaac grow and become a man. When Sarah died at the age of 127, Abraham bought the cave of Machpelah as a burial place, establishing a permanent place for his family in the Promised Land. Concerned about Isaac's future, Abraham sent his oldest servant back to his homeland to find a wife for his son. The servant returned with Rebekah, who married Isaac and brought comfort after his mother's death. Abraham married again to a woman named Keturah, with whom he had more children. However, he gave everything he owned to Isaac, ensuring that the child of the promise received his full inheritance. Abraham died at the age of 175, old and full of years, and was buried by his sons Isaac and Ishmael in the cave of Machpelah, alongside Sarah. Abraham's life is a powerful testimony of faith, obedience, and perseverance. His journey from an ordinary man in Ur to becoming the father of many nations is filled with valuable lessons for all generations. Unwavering faith. Abraham demonstrated extraordinary faith by leaving his homeland and going to an unknown destination, trusting solely in God's promise. This faith was repeatedly tested throughout his life, culminating in the sacrifice of Isaac, where Abraham proved his willingness to trust God above all else. Obedience. Abraham's life was marked by acts of obedience to God, even when the divine commands seemed difficult or impossible to understand. His readiness to obey, often without question, is a powerful example of submission to divine will. Perseverance. Abraham waited 25 years for the promise of a child with Sarah to be fulfilled. During that time, he faced doubts, temptations, and challenges, but he never gave up trusting in God's promises. His perseverance is a reminder that God's plans often unfold on a different timetable than we expect. Compassion and intercession. Abraham's intercession for Sodom reveals his compassionate heart. He did not hesitate to intercede for others, even those living in sin. This teaches us about the importance of caring for the well-being of others and interceding for them before God. Hospitality. The way Abraham received the three visitors demonstrates the importance of hospitality in that culture and serves as an example of how we should treat others, whether they are acquaintances or strangers. Learning from mistakes. Abraham's life was not without mistakes. His decision to pass off Sarah as his sister in Egypt or to have a child with Hagar shows that even great men of faith can make mistakes. However, Abraham learned from these experiences and continued to grow in his faith and obedience to God. Enduring legacy. Abraham is revered as the father of faith by three major monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. His legacy of faith and obedience continues to inspire millions of people around the world, thousands of years after his death. Abraham's story reminds us that God often chooses ordinary people to accomplish his extraordinary purposes. Abraham was not perfect, but his willingness to trust and obey God made him one of the most influential figures in religious history. His journey teaches us that faith is not just passive belief, but active trust that leads us to act on God's promises, even when circumstances seem impossible. Abraham's life is a testimony to the transformative power of faith and God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises. Abraham's story does not end with his death. His legacy continued through his descendants, particularly through Isaac and Jacob, later called Israel. The promises God made to Abraham were fulfilled in ways he probably could not have imagined during his lifetime. Nation. The Israelites, descendants of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, became a great nation, fulfilling God's promise to make Abraham the father of a great people. Land. Although Abraham lived as a foreigner in the Promised Land, his descendants eventually possessed it as God had promised. Blessing to all nations. Through Abraham's lineage came Jesus Christ, considered by Christians as the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise to bless all nations through Abraham. Abraham's story remains relevant today for several reasons. Model of faith. Abraham is often cited as an example of true faith. His willingness to trust God, even in impossible circumstances, serves as a model for believers of all ages. Importance of obedience. Abraham's life demonstrates that true faith leads to obedience. His readiness to obey God, even when it seemed to go against his own interests, is a challenge to all who seek to follow God. Patience and perseverance. Abraham's long wait for God's promises to be fulfilled teaches us about the importance of patience and perseverance in the journey of faith. Divine grace. Abraham's story is a powerful testimony of God's grace. Despite Abraham's failures and doubts, God remained faithful to His promises, demonstrating that His grace is greater than our weaknesses. Call to bless others. God's promise to Abraham that he would be a blessing to all nations reminds us of our responsibility to be a blessing to others, regardless of their background or beliefs. In a world that often values immediacy and instant gratification, Abraham's story invites us to a long-term journey of faith. It challenges us to trust in a God who operates on a much larger time scale than ours, fulfilling His promises in ways that often exceed our understanding. Abraham's life teaches us that true greatness lies not in our personal achievements, but in our willingness to follow God's call, even when the path is uncertain. It reminds us that each of us has a role to play in God's grand plan, and that our faithfulness today can have impacts that extend far beyond our own lifetime. May Abraham's story continue to inspire future generations to live with faith, courage, and obedience, trusting that the God who called Abraham continues to call ordinary people to extraordinary purposes in our time.